the VIHG, and we are in chapters 49 to 50 of the Nectar of Devotion. This is the mixing of Rasas. Right. So we want to acknowledge Banuswami and David Haberman, whose translations of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu were essential to teaching this course. So this is the nectar ocean of the mellow of devotion, and we're looking at, this is wave 8 in the Northern Ocean. So we're doing Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 4.8, 1 to 85, Nectar Devotion chapters 49 to 50. So Srila Prabhupada starts out this section with something that's not in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. He starts out with a little review that there's 5 primary or direct and 7 secondary indirect rasas, and that sometimes these can be mixed together. So the 5 direct or primary are neutrality, servitorship, friendship, parental, and conjugal. And the 7 secondary or indirect are humor, chivalry, wonder, anger, fear, or dread, disgust, or ghastliness, compassion, or lamentation. Wonder can also be called astonishment. Humor can also be called laughter. So this is a review from the Southern Ocean, wave 5. That sometimes these rasas can be single and sometimes they can be mixed. If they're single, they're called kevala. So there's some mixtures of these rasas, primary with primary, primary with secondary, secondary with secondary, primary with secondary with secondary. Somebody needs to mute. That are friendly, and some that are unfriendly. Again, somebody needs to mute. Maybe the host could figure out who's making the funny noises and mute that. So we're going to look at the definitions and basic understanding of what do we mean. So there's 5 ways in which we can talk about how these rasas are mixing, either in a friendly way or in an unfriendly way. And one is within the devotee themselves. So the devotee themselves may have mixtures of these primary and secondary rasas that may be on a long-term basis, or it may be on a short-term basis. A devotee may observe Krishna exhibiting rasas friendly or unfriendly to his primary or secondary rasas. And just realized this is our old English gender system. They may observe other devotees exhibiting friendly or inimical rasas. They may observe neutral parties or enemies. So let's just look at this again, because this is important. So if a person themselves, let's say the devotee themselves, is in neutrality, they may also have a mixture of something else. They might have a mixture of friendship, or they may get a mixture of astonishment, or a mixture of chivalry with their own servitorship within themselves. Or they may be in servitorship and they may observe Krishna acting in friendly rasa. Or they have servitorship in themselves and they see other devotees acting in parental rasa. They have servitorship in themselves, and they may see neutral parties, people who are not their own friends or their own enemies, exhibiting other rasas. They may see a neutral person exhibiting, say, the neutral rasa, or they may observe enemies to themselves exhibiting other rasas. Now, what do we mean by a friendly rasa? By a friendly rasa, we mean a rasa that nourishes your own rasa. In any of these. So something that helps and nourishes the devotee's own rasa. And by unfriendly, we mean something that restricts one's own rasa, being inappropriate. I mean, this is a very easy thing to understand, even materially, right? I mean, it's just some things that we observe or experience nourish our basic way of being, and some things restrict it. So these are going to be different for different people. All right. So now Rupa Goswami and Srila Prabhupada each give a list. So we're going to go through this a little bit quickly. I'm going to take about 15 minutes to go through this list. So for the neutral rasa, for the Shanta rasa, the friendly rasas among both the primary and secondary are servitude, ghastliness, righteous chivalry, so that's dharma vira, and wonder. What's unfriendly is conjugal, fighting chivalry, or yudhavira. Then for the self-satisfied, because there's two different categories of Shantaras, anger and fear, anger and dread. And for the performer of austerities, anger is unfriendly. That makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, people who are very equipoised, for them, anger is at odds. It's going to diminish, it's going to restrict their feeling of being equipoised. Same with fear, right? Or a fighting mood. So we look at the two categories, the tapasvi Shantaras, the devotee who's in Shantaras as a performer of austerities. So if enemies show disgust at their renunciation, that increases their tolerance and determination. That's interesting, right? If people criticize, oh, why are you sleeping on the floor? I remember when I read I don't remember the name of the book, it was years ago, by Thomas Merton, a famous Catholic monk who wrote an appreciation of Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita. He said that before he became a monk, if he would party all night, stay up all night and just fall asleep on the floor, people would think, oh, wonderful. And once he became a monk and he was praying all night and sleeping on the floor, people criticized him. But that increased his sense of, okay, I'm going to be tolerant, I'm going to be equipoised. Then a tapasvi Santaras may have disgust for his own body or for materialism, which reinforces his renunciation. Now, I want you to remember that for next week's class, because too much disgust actually destroys rasa, which I find fascinating. Then contemplating the process of dharma, this is why dharma vira is favorable. Contemplating the practice of dharma followed by Krishna and Krishna's devotees also nourishes the tapasvi. Okay, the Atmarama Shantaras. So they're so neutral, practically nothing nourishes or harms them. That's really kind of interesting. So when poets describe Krishna's qualities, when devotees practice dharma, when people are disgusted by material life, even when they feel some disgust or material life, that doesn't nourish them and it doesn't hurt them. But both types of neutral devotees are nourished by wonder at the Lord's sweetness being greater than the bliss of Brahman. Now, again, you want to remember that for next week, because absorption in Brahman by these people destroys their rasa. They're also, those in neutrality are also nourished by the Lord's defeating his enemies. All right, for the servitude rasa, What's friendly is neutrality, ghastliness, righteous chivalry, dharmavira, and charitable chivalry, dhanavira. What restricts them is the conjugal rasa. And you remember, right, that when we discussed servitude, we said that those who are in reverential devotion, whether they're servants or whether they're younger brothers or sisters or children of Krishna, they don't discuss the conjugal rasa. And you can think of this, for children, it's really, I mean, they like to see that their parents love each other, but to see their parents actually being like intimate with each other is very disturbing. So conjugal fighting chivalry to Krishna is restrictive, or being angry at Krishna is restrictive because they're very reverential, right? And if there's anger to Krishna or yudhavir at Krishna, I'm going to fight with you like the friends, then it causes them to lose respect. But when they see anger and fighting of the Lord and the devotees towards enemies, that nourishes them, as it does with the Shantaras. Oh, wow, how Krishna and Arjuna are defeating the Kurus. All right, in the friendship rasa, so what's nourishing is conjugal, laughter, of course, laughter among friendship, and fighting chivalry. So this is typical, again, even in material friendship. And material friendship, laughter and play fighting is very nourishing. What's unfriendly is parental, because then you have a superior mood. And if you have a question about that, we'll get to that at the very end. Anger towards Krishna and fear towards Krishna. All right, some explanation of this. So parental anger and disgust directed towards Krishna are unfavorable if displayed in friendship devotee and directed towards Krishna. And why did we say conjugal was friendly? So the friendly devotee seeing Krishna with the gopis or seeing Krishna with the queens is favorable. When you're someone's friend, to see them happy in their marriage or in their love life also brings you happiness. All right, in the parental rasa, what's friendly are laughter and fear. You're going to be afraid for your child's safety, and you're going to be delighting in your child. What's unfriendly is conjugal, fighting chivalry, so yudhavir, servitude, and anger to Krishna. So fighting chivalry is unfavorable because the parents want to protect their child. Parents may like to see the child competing with their friends, and the parents show anger superficially, and Krishna acts fearfully and may show up anger, but that makes the parents remorseful. So for the conjugal rasa, so what's friendly is laughter and friendship, and yudhavir and dharmavir can be favorable or unfavorable. Different persons have different opinions. What's unfriendly is parental, ghastliness or disgust, neutrality, anger, and dread. And remember, we did discuss in the anger rasa exactly, like there could be anger at your other friends who are angry at Krishna, but you don't really get angry at Krishna. All right, for the laughter rasa, what's friendly is ghastliness. You can laugh at some disgusting things. Conjugal, friendship, and parental, and what's inimical is compassion, which is also lamentation. They're opposites. Laughter and crying and lamenting are opposites, and fear. Fear takes away laughter. Now that we could discuss that actually at length. Again, these are also true materially. So, for example, in our body, when we're very fearful, our body gets ready for the flight or fight response, or sometimes one can also freeze. And our body goes into it. Fear puts us into a danger response. It puts out the stress hormones in the body, right? Things like cortisol and adrenaline. And laughter tells us that we're safe. Now, sometimes when people are very scared, they laugh. That is true. But the laughter of comedy, we only really laugh in comedy when we feel safe. So one of the ways to calm the body down when it's under danger is to do something funny or experiencing something funny, because that communicates to the body when you're safe. Okay, the wonder rasa. So all the 5 primary rasas and all types of chivalry. So anger and ghastliness are considered unfriendly, but as was said before with wonder, the essence of any rasa is astonishment. So even anger and ghastliness have some degree of astonishment. Therefore, we cannot say that they're absolutely unfriendly. Okay, for chivalry, all kinds of chivalry, wonder, laughter, friendship, and servitude are friendly. But fear is not. I mean, and again, that makes a lot of sense. When you're feeling chivalrous, you're feeling brave. It's utsa. You're feeling brave enthusiasm. So fear would be incompatible. And you can't have neutrality if you're in fighting chivalry. Again, you can understand why it's incompatible. You're just neutral. Why would you fight? Now, sometimes parental ras can be favorable for fighting chivalry. Like in the case of Balaram and others, they have some touch of Vatsalya ras, but they also fight with Krishna and with the other cowherd boys for Krishna's entertainment. And then the inhabitants of Vraja, for whom their feeling of Vatsalya, their feeling of parental love, is favorable for their Danavir. So like Nanda Maharaj, who's giving charity for the benefit of Krishna. Then compassion, which is also lamentation. So what's friendly is parental and anger. And what's unfriendly is laughter. Again, those are opposites. Wonder, although in one sense, wonder is there in every rasa. And meeting in conjugal. So when you're meeting Krishna as his lover or wife, you're not going to be crying in lamentation. Okay, for the anger rasa, compassion. And in fact, this is very interesting. If you're feeling very angry at someone, the cure for that is compassion. Right? So there's some friendliness there. And you can feel lamentation. Compassion is also lamentation as part of anger. And all chivalry is nourished by anger. All right, then you have unfriendly is laughter, which makes sense, unless you're laughing at the foolishness of your enemy, but that's not quite comedy. Conjugal and fear. Although it's interesting because under anger can be fear. When we talked about the different Vyavichari bhavs, and sometimes the secondary rasas can act as Vyavichari bhavs, when we talked about Vyavichari bhavs, we found that under a feeling of anger can be fear. That's quite common, in fact. And then for the fear or dread rasa, ghastliness and compassion are friendly, and chivalry, conjugal, laughter, and anger are unfriendly. Now, compassion nourishes fear by thinking of future separation from the lover and the consequent suffering. And chivalry, conjugal, laughter, and anger are unfavorable when they're manifest in the person experiencing fear. They may not be unfavorable in others. So in ghastliness or horror, the shantaras of austerity is friendly, because a lot of the neutral ras of those performing austerities is they feel some disgust toward the world, the idea of spinning and sex life and so forth. Laughter is very friendly, right? Sometimes there's laughter at things that are horrible and disgusting, and servitude. And then unfriendly or conjugal and friendship. Now, again, this is the neutral austerity. So the servitude of a person who's just come to the stage of rati is favorable for ghastliness, because such a person shows disgust for material life. And not all laughter is favorable. So only when clowning persons assume a disgusting dress is it favorable. Okay, so any combination not mentioned is neutral, because I had a question in the chat about anything that's not mentioned, then it is neutral, neither nourishing nor restricting. So why is it important to discuss these things? This may seem very technical, and I know when I first read Nectar of Devotion, I was like, there's no way I'm going to remember this. Why is it important? Why does it matter? Okay. And Srila Prabhupada explains from the Nectar of Devotion why it's important. He says, when Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was in Jagannath Puri, many poets and devotees used to come to him and offer their different kinds of poetry. But Swarup Damodar first examined all of these scrutinizingly. And if he would find that there was no incompatibility in the rasa, he would then allow the poet to approach Lord Chaitanya and recite his poetry. And Prabhupada further says, the topic of incompatibility is a very important one, and those who are pure devotees always expect to find perfect compatibility in descriptions of the different relationships with the personality of Godhead. The study of compatibility and incompatibility sometimes becomes very involved. It's a little bit of an understatement. And Prabhupada gives an example of how it's involved. He says, when a friend meets another friend, and this also Rupa Goswami says, the mellow produced out of that meeting is generally, the mellow means a rasa, is generally taken as very palatable, but actually with such meetings between two friends, there are so many feelings involved that it is difficult to ascertain when these feelings are actually becoming compatible and when they are becoming incompatible. And if we can each think back to the last time we were with a friend, and there were some compatible feelings and some incompatible feelings, and sometimes it wasn't so possible to sort them out. So being able to understand these things is very important for us. If we just go back for a minute here, they're very important for us when we are understanding what we should read and relish and what we should not. So when I first joined the Hare Krishna movement, we only read Srila Prabhupada's books, and we were told, don't read anything else but Srila Prabhupada's books. And of course, Srila Prabhupada in his books often tells us to read the books of our acharyas, just like we're not just studying Srila Prabhupada's Nectar of Devotion here, but we're also studying the book on which the Nectar of Devotion was based, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, because Prabhupada just wrote a summary study. Also, we have some difficulty with Nectar of Devotion. Srila Prabhupada himself says in the Nectar of Devotion that he couldn't find the English equivalent for all of those words. And as it was a book published very early in the Krishna consciousness movement, his disciples were not of any help in doing that either. And nor were they able to provide editorial guidance very easily, because the concepts were just way beyond them. And Srila Prabhupada, of course, wants us to read many of the books of our acharyas, and he also wants us to write our own books. But sometimes when devotees write their own books, if they're not very expert in the science, they may end up doing something which, instead of nourishing devotees' feelings towards Krishna, actually restricts it. And I think we've all experienced, sometimes we go to a Shastra class and the devotee giving the class ends up restricting or impeding our own feelings of enthusiasm. I mean, I remember at a certain time in my practice of Krishna consciousness in in ISKCON society. There were devotees giving classes that were so full of ghastliness. And I was a young married woman with a child at the time, and the classes were so full of ghastliness towards the Grihastha ashram that I would come home from the classes simply in tears and just devastated. And perhaps it was nourishing to somebody else, but it was very restrictive to me. So we have some people who may have incompatibility of rasas with ourself or with ourself at a particular time, or they may just not be very expert at knowing how to combine these different rasas. And we also have to be careful with ourselves. I mean, some months ago, I was having a discussion with a devotee, and it was really very, very sweet. We were talking a lot about Krishna's name, form, qualities, and pastimes. And then I said something in ghastliness, and the devotee became very disturbed. And it's don't speak like this. This is not compatible with the topics we were discussing. And I immediately realized, yes, I had done something. I had just restricted the whole flow of the kata by introducing something incompatible. So this is something that we need to be careful with ourselves. We need to be careful when hearing from others. We need to be careful with reading from others. Sometimes certain translations, I know that I was reading one translation of one of the books of the Goswamis, and I thought this translation it's not, the translator is not understanding the rasas here. They've translated in a backwards way so that they're giving the opposite impression. And then I went to another translation, and oh yes, this is the right translation. And another thing to keep in, so there's sort of several ways to look at this. One is that on an absolute platform, we could say that there are certain things that are always incompatible. We could say that certain things, just like Swarup Damodar said, okay, it's just incompatible. It shouldn't be shown to Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. The person is mixing things in a way that's really unpalatable. The one example I can think of that is some years ago, I was asked by my GBC, my local GBC authority, to attend a class in the area that was being given to find out what was the mood, and some devotee was coming to give class in the area, and he asked myself and some other people to go kind of check it out. And the person giving the class was doing very much what I said I was doing in that one discussion a few months ago, where they were talking about pastimes, and they were talking about, it was all very, very sweet. And then they would intersperse it with disgust. In my case, in my discussion with that other devotee, I interspersed it with disgust about myself. So we were talking about these pastimes, Krishna's name, form, qualities, pastimes, and I ended up saying something like, oh, but I'm so low and so fallen. And it just destroyed it. It restricted the whole mood of what we were talking about. With this devotee's class that I went to, the person was talking about Krishna's name, form, qualities, and pastimes, and then would intersperse that with organizational and political criticism of ISKCON and things going on among the devotees. And it was so unpalatable. I felt like, I mean, we're going to see later that it's like grass, pieces of grass in nectar. The way I thought of it was like sand in sweet rice, like you're eating the sweet rice and then you come to this sand thing. Or, if somebody doesn't mix salt properly in a prep, they put in the salt, but they didn't mix it. And so you come to some parts where you just like get this clump of salt. So it felt like that. And the whole thing was very restrictive. So there may be instances where a person is improperly mixing rasas. I mean, there is a time and a place and a situation where we want to talk about problems in our sanghas. That's a fact. There is a proper time and place for that. If I'm meeting with ISKCON managers and we're talking about, okay, what's going wrong and what could be fixed. But the time to talk about that is not when talking about Krishna's Vrindavan pastimes. So, there's an improper mixing in general. And then there's an improper mixing for different individuals. So what nourishes Krishna Das may be restrictive for Ram Das, and what nourishes Ram Das may be restricted for Krishna Das. And a very instructive situation in this regard is with my god sister Jamuna, where she and her friend had gotten their own place. They had their own ashram, separate from an ISKCON temple, which of course now is extremely common in our society of devotees, but in those days it was very uncommon. And so some of the ISKCON leaders complained to Srila Prabhupada about them, that they were doing something independently. Of course, they weren't like entirely independent, but anyway, so they went to Srila Prabhupada and they said, Srila Prabhupada, should we give up our ashram that we've created and move into the temple ashram? And Srila Prabhupada said, you Westerners always want to change things. Why do you want to change? Why are you so restless? And they said, but Prabhupada, how are we part of your society? Prabhupada said, if you're chanting Hare Krishna and you're following, you're part of ISKCON. And then they said, what about association with devotees? And Prabhupada said, if two are compatible, they are making good advancement. And if there's 200 that are incompatible, no one is making any advancement. So what's compatible and what's incompatible is different for different people. And this is something to keep in mind. There are certain devotees where their way of presenting Krishna consciousness and their mood is not compatible with me. I find it it's restrictive, it's constrictive of my own feelings and my own motivation. But those devotees those preachers are very nourishing for other people. Just because they're not nourishing for me doesn't mean they're not nourishing. And so there's this variety. And such is true not only within, say, ISKCON, but such is also true within, say, different branches of the Gaudiya Sampradaya. This is true even within different branches of the other Sampradayas. So Prabhupada writes, there's many societies of pure devotees, and what's nourishing for some people is restrictive for others. It's one reason why the Chaitanya tree is not like a palm tree. It's not like a coconut tree that just has one trunk and no branches. It's a tree with many, many branches. And this is part of unity in diversity. So there may be a tendency to think that what is nourishing for me must be nourishing for everybody else, or what's restrictive for me must be restrictive for everybody else. Now, also, as we progress in our Krishna consciousness, what nourishes us and what's restricting for us may change. And these things may also change according to a particular time. So as we're in a particular, just like, if someone's loved one just died and you go and tell jokes, it's going to be restrictive. But such might not have been true a week before when their loved one had not died and you were just being there with your friends telling jokes. It might have been nourishing for them. So one must know what is nourishing and what is restrictive at different times. And this is such an important part of a deeply personal philosophy. All right, so I want to take 10 minutes for questions on what we've discussed so far. So we have a question here. Does it mean we should take a neutral stand in presenting a Shastra class? No, we are who we are. You're not going to become somebody other than who you are. But just keep in mind, some people will be nourished when you're teaching, and some people will feel restrictive, and some people will be neutral. You're not going to be able to nourish everybody all the time. Daivasimha Prabhu.
Hi, Krishna. Mataji, I have a question that you said that compassion is the anger can be dealt with with the compassion. So, what if I am feeling angry over some devotee? So, can you elaborate upon this? And I've also seen that this compassion, that sometimes when anger is not being dealt properly, and when the wounded preacher or wounded speaker of the Bhagavatam, then he just because he's not himself healed properly, he himself has not dealt with the anger properly. Then that's come up in any Bhagavatam discussion or in the form of some bipolar statements. I may be wrong, but this is what I've seen that generally
Okay,
it's like a
so we
it's like a
want to
physician.
remember that here we're discussing spiritual rasas, but these also are applicable to the material rasas. Okay. So anger and compassion, if you're feeling angry toward someone, you may also feel, if you feel compassion for them, your anger will dissipate. But compassion in the form of lamentation is very connected often to anger. So grief, if you think of that rasa, karuna rasa, as grief instead of compassion. When people are very upset and grieving, they often become angry. Yes, you may feel anger towards someone, thank you, Rukmini, out of compassion for a third party. So Parikshit was feeling compassion for the cow and the bull, and therefore he felt anger at Kali. Or you may be lamenting yourself. You're very upset yourself, and you may feel anger at somebody because you're upset yourself. Now, materially, Trividam Narakashedam Kamakroda Tataslavas, these lust, anger, and greed are the gates to hell. So the material perversion of these rasas, some of them are very dangerous. Anger is very dangerous. Lust, anger, and greed are very dangerous for our spiritual life the vast majority of the time. And so for those who are practicing Krishna consciousness, for those who are not experiencing anger as a rasa with Krishna, one should really learn how to deal with these negative material emotions. Things like lamentation, fear, anger. One should learn how to process them appropriately, neither expressing them, escaping them, nor repressing them, but having neutrality toward them. And we remember that neutrality is, as was explained earlier with neutrality, it's a stage. For some people, it's their eternal position in rasa with the Lord, but for others, it's a stage. And one must have this neutrality of being equipoised toward these material emotions in order to experience the spiritual emotions. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that one first come to a platform of being equipoised and then experience the spiritual emotions. But one can, as one experiences the spiritual emotions, interest in the material reflections of those emotions will naturally decrease. And if someone hasn't properly processed the material emotions, that's such, and it doesn't have to be anger, it can be other emotions, but anger is a real problem. It will pervert their preaching of Krishna consciousness. So that point you brought up is a very important one. And therefore, knowing how to deal with the material emotions, material thoughts, material desires is a very important part of sadhana, which I'm convinced is often not taught very well amongst our devotees, that our devotees often are not being given very good and clear instructions, although it's all throughout the scripture and all throughout Srila Prabhupada's purports and the works of our Acharya, how one should have neutrality and equanimity towards these, not repression, not suppression, but equanimity. Any other question? And thank you, Devi Simha, for bringing up those very important points.
Hare Krishna, Mataji.
Hare Krishna.
Yeah, it's me. There was, I'm just trying to figure out, in the early 80s, classes were so intense, almost like pep talks, and felt, very early 80s, and you felt like very uncomfortable a lot of the times. But I was thinking about it now. I can't relate to sort of what we gathered from it or what we felt from it. And it was mostly like a little bit of confusion, or was it right, or was it not right? And it's still like that till today. And how would you explain that? Can you help?
Yeah, that classes like that, whether they were in 1975 or 1981, or whether they're in 2022, if they're disturbing, it's due to one of two causes. Well, one of three. Let's put three. One is that the person isn't, as Devi Simha Prabhu brought up, the person isn't properly processing their material emotions, thoughts, and desires, and they're polluting their preaching of Krishna consciousness with some material agenda, often without their knowing, innocently maybe. So that's one problem. They're polluting everything. Another is that they're mixing rasas in a general way that's going to be disturbing for anybody. And this is the kind of thing that Swarup Damodar was guarding against for Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And again, this is usually done innocently. We find the stories in Chaitanya Charitamrita where this is done, is that the devotee doing it their intention was to please Krishna. They weren't purposely doing that. We also find some instances where other devotees couldn't discern that Swarup Damodar was specifically empowered to be able to discern that. So, and another cause could be that it just isn't nourishing to me, that it's nourishing to others, but it's just not nourishing to me. It's an incompatible mix. And this is true in general material life. There are people that I'm friends with that other people would never be friends with those people. And vice versa. There's some people that I'm like, I would never be friends with them, but somebody else could be a friend with them. It's like not everybody can marry anybody. We had a view in the early days of ISKCON that if the man's a devotee and the woman's a devotee, that they'll be happy together. But it's just rubbish. Some people are compatible, some people aren't. Just like that. Though that doesn't mean, that particular man may not be compatible with me. But that doesn't mean he's not compatible with anybody. So in the same way, a person giving the class, it may not be compatible with me or you, but it might be compatible with somebody else. Or it might be compatible with nobody because the person doesn't know how to mix things, or they may be mixing their own, unprocessed, unhealed, emotional desire stuff with Krishna consciousness, and that's particularly unsettling. Prabhupada Priya?
Kind of following along from Devi Singh Prabhu's question, is it necessary actually to process all those material emotions first? Or if we're actually experiencing some spiritual emotions in relationship to Krishna, is it just a matter of getting a higher taste or coming to identify more strongly with the spiritual emotions, and then the other ones just kind of fade away because you no longer identify with them? They really don't mean much to you anymore.
Well, this question is at the heart of Arjuna's question at the beginning of chapter 12 of the Bhagavad Gita. So it's a significant question. It's being asked by Arjuna, and it's a it's a misunderstanding that happens a lot. Arjuna says, basically he's asking, should I take up bhakti from the beginning? Bhakti means thinking, feeling, and willing in relationship to Krishna. As we read in Nectar of Devotion, chapter 2, sadhana bhakti begins with always thinking of Krishna. Manmana bhava mad bhakto. And mind means thinking, feeling, and willing. Feeling is emotions. He said, or first should I realize Atma? Should I realize myself? Or could I realize Brahman? Srila Prabhupada translates that section basically as, should I take up impersonalism first? And neutrality could be understood like that, although the neutral rasa is not impersonal. Neutral rasa is toward Vishnu. So many devotees have this same question, that should I first become absolutely neutral, equipoise towards all material thoughts, feelings, and desires, and then I can cultivate spiritual emotions for Krishna? Or should I cultivate spiritual emotions for Krishna from the very beginning, which will be mixed with material emotions? And gradually, as I develop spiritual emotions for Krishna, will my material emotions decrease? So Krishna's recommendation, Srila Prabhupada's recommendation, Rupa Goswami's recommendation, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's recommendation is the latter. Now, the example that I always give is that, let's say you have this cup. Let's say this cup is your consciousness, and it's filled with material thoughts, emotions, and desires. So one thing is you could empty it out first. Make sure there's no drops, empty cup. Okay, when it's empty, then you could fill it with your spiritual, this is from Mahalakshmi, thank you. You could fill it with your spiritual emotions. All right. So that's one way of going about things. However, emptying yourself of thoughts, feelings, and desires is very difficult. Klesho dika tarashtesham, avyakta shaktatechasam, avyakta hi gatir dukam, tena vadvir avapite. It's difficult and it's unnatural. So this is the path of primarily of the Nirvisesa Sunyavadi folks. But it's also very common in Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Dhyana Yoga. Karma Yoga, which is aimed at the universal form, Jnana Yoga, which is aimed at the Brahman, and Dhyana Yoga, which is aimed at Paramatma. Generally, their process is like that. Develop detachment towards all thoughts, feelings, and desires, thinking, feeling, and willing. But of course, Srila Prabhupada explains that, first of all, it's very difficult to do that. Second of all, once you've done that, then developing the spiritual thoughts, feelings, and desires is also difficult because you've been habituated to having neutrality towards all thoughts, feelings, and desires. And therefore, we are reading that the Shanta Bhaktas in neutrality, who love the Lord, they're not impersonalists, they love Lord Vishnu, but they're not moved by poets' descriptions about Krishna. They're just neutral. So it may be difficult if one achieves neutrality to go on to having this depth of, and we find those in Shantaras, they never come to the, they're not at the platform in prema. It's too intense for them. So the other technique is you have this cup full of material thoughts, feelings, and desires. Now, you have to have something under it because you're going to make a mess here. So if you have this cup, and I'm not actually going to do this because I'm not going to risk making a mess by my computer, but let's say you have this cup full of thoughts, feelings, material thoughts, feelings, and desires, and you don't empty it. You just simply start pouring in, and I have this closed, so I won't actually do it. So you start pouring in your spiritual thoughts, feelings, and desires. You start pouring it in and pouring it in. And again, you have to have some overflow there, so it may be a little messy, but you know, you're just pouring it in and pouring it in. And as you do this, the proportion changes. So you start having more and more spiritual thoughts, feelings, and desires, and less material. And as long as you just keep pouring in the spiritual, then after a while, your cup will be full of just the spiritual. Yes, Prabhupada, like Prabhupada says, pouring milk into a cup of ink. Yes, Prabhupada gives that analogy, although most of us don't have cups of ink, so I don't usually use that. You know, when Prabhupada was growing up, you had ink cups that's how you wrote. You dip your pen into an ink cup. I don't think any of us write like that. So it's that analogy, like we're like, what? A cup of ink? Why would you a cup of ink? It's like when Prabhupada says the hot iron rod in the fire, you know, he grew up going to a blacksmith shop. And we're like, oh, what? Why would you put an iron rod in the fire? What? You know, unless we regularly see a blacksmith. Anyway, when you do that, you never have an empty cup. It's much easier, it's much more natural, and you never have an empty cup. And I show it like you have material desires, thoughts, and feelings. They're high, and this is the way Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur describes it in Madhurya Kadambini. And your spiritual emotions, thoughts, and desires, you start out with practically nothing. And as you increase the spiritual, the material decreases. When you're about halfway, you're considered liberated, you're at nishta. And as you increase the spiritual, the material goes away. Now, there is a caveat here. One also has to cultivate detachment from material thoughts, feelings, and desires. Yes, there would be messes of overflows. How are you going to deal with this mess of this overflow? The way you're going to deal with avoiding a mess of an overflow is one also has to cultivate, yes, a good drain system. Oh, you guys are so clever. It's much chitama gita pranam, bodhayantas praspram katayantas chamam nityam tushanti charamanticha. Such a joy. Yes, what is a good drain system? A good drain system is, it is part of sadhana bhakti to develop neutrality towards material thoughts, feelings, and desires. The difference is that's not our exclusive program. While you're pouring in the spiritual thoughts, feelings, and desires, one is also intentionally cultivating neutrality toward the material thoughts, feelings, and desires. So in Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Dhyan Yoga, generally, they're exclusively doing that, and they wait till they've perfected that before they go to the spiritual emotions. We're doing it simultaneously. We're pouring in the spiritual thoughts, feelings, and desires while we intentionally, purposely cultivate neutrality toward the material thoughts, feelings, and desires. And if one doesn't intentionally, purposely use techniques of cultivating detachment and neutrality towards the material thoughts, feelings, and desires, there's a big overflow and a big mess while you're in the process. All right. Anything else? Then we're going to take a break.
Mataji, thank you so much. In the movement since a long time, I never heard such a clear and very much sense-making explanation of this dilemma. This is very nice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. But I am sure and certain that there are some people who would find my explanation restrictive rather than nourishing. That's just the way it is. That also we should have neutrality towards. I'm not going to be able to nourish everybody. That's never possible. Vinata?
Hare Krishna. I was thinking this whole thing, when we learn all these incompatibilities and compatibilities, it looks very complicated. But when you live it, like you feel that something doesn't work for you. So is it that we should like upgrade our feelings with the knowledge from the books, or just
Yes,
the knowledge,
sounds very good.
all the knowledge will just purify us? I mean, upgrade with analytical approach, or the knowledge will just purify us and somehow permeate us, and then our feeling will be much more authentic.
Either one will work, but these books are here for a reason. And Prabhupada's telling us that it's important to study these things. You know, without studying these things, my feeling of restriction in certain circumstances, I may take as something that I should try to get rid of. Does that make sense? I should think, well, I should just like everybody's way of preaching. And I should just like anything. Like I remember many years ago at a festival, so I said to one devotee, this prasadam is wonderful. And she said, all prasadam is wonderful. You know, that's just not true for me as an individual. And, you know, what I find tasty, you might find awful. And what I find that I can't eat at all, you may find very tasty. So if we try to suppress that and we think that's wrong, that seems to me as being impersonalism. So when we have these feelings of restriction and wait, that's restricting my Krishna, it appears to be Krishna consciousness, but it's restricting my Krishna consciousness. We have several alternatives. The person doesn't have a good drain system for their material thoughts, feelings, and desires. And so when they're pouring in the Krishna consciousness, they're making a big mess. Or they're mixing up these tastes in a general way that Swarup Damodar would say, no. Or they're experiencing something that's genuine and it's compatible for them, but it's not compatible with me. And we should be very careful that we don't always jump to the general conclusions. It may just be not compatible with me, or it may not be compatible with me now in this moment. So that's also the case. I may be experiencing certain things in relationship to Krishna in this moment. Like that discussion I had with that devotee when I was expressing ghastliness at my own fallen nature. It was very inappropriate in that moment, but it would be appropriate in other moments. So yes, we want to balance between our natural reaction of feeling nourished and feeling restricted with Shastra. If we don't have that along with Shastra, we may be just driven by something else. So but we don't want this just as some intellectual thing, or, oh yeah, okay, I've got to memorize all these lists. Should one gently leave the place? If I can, I do. Or I'll just start chanting Hare Krishna in my mind. And sometimes, you know, I just learned that certain people and certain people's preaching it may be incompatible with me at that moment, or for some, it's just generally incompatible. And I just learned that. That doesn't mean that person is having this improper mixture in general. It may just not be suitable for me. And one way I look is I see, are there people who are being nourished? And are there people who are exhibiting the fruits of bhakti by this person's association? This is one of the ways that I can gauge. So some people, by their preaching, many people are disturbed, and those who are enlivened are not exhibiting the fruits of Krishna consciousness. Judge a tree by its fruits. Jesus said this, Prabhupada said this. So let's say so-and-so, Das, so-and-so, whatever, Dasi, you know, they're preaching in a way where whoever feels nourished by them becomes offensive, becomes angry, becomes critical, then I can understand that that person's preaching in general has improper mixtures. But if a person's preaching doesn't nourish me, but they are nourishing other people who are then exhibiting the proper devotional qualities as a result, then I can understand that it's just an incompatibility with me. And again, there may be an incompatibility with me at a particular point in time. That's not a general incompatibility. But yeah, one shouldn't be exposing oneself to something that's restricting one's feeling for Krishna. I mean, it's just like I shouldn't force myself to eat food that makes my body unhealthy. Prabhupada Priya, and then we need to take a break.
I'm wondering if there could be a scenario where the incompatibility that we're feeling is not necessarily incompatibility with our actual genuine spiritual feelings towards Krishna, but it's just incompatibility with a particular anartha, which is good because then it kind of like shows that to us and shakes it up, and maybe that's what we need to hear. But how do we distinguish between what it's incompatible with, whether it's incompatible with anartha or with our actual feelings for Krishna? So
this is the kind of question Satguru Maharaj called a stump the guru question. So this is the kind of questions I like to get in a class. How do we tell if our feeling of discomfort is coming because someone's hitting on something we need to fix, rather than it's actually an incompatibility? Well, you can make a little experiment. You can try, this is what I usually do. I mean, it depends again on what is the nature of the discomfort. When I heard that class where a person was talking about, super high leelas interspersed with criticizing ISKCON, it was very clear to me that it wasn't a case of somebody hitting on an anartha of mine, that it was just a Rasa Basa situation in general. If someone says something like that, try, push it a little. All right, let me try to accept this and see what happens. I mean, an analogy would be somebody, okay, a good analogy is this. So yesterday, one of the devotees made oat utma. Now, just hearing that, you might think, oat utma? What? And I saw it and I'm like, what is this? And she said, it's oat utma. And I thought, that doesn't sound good. And it doesn't look good. But let me try it. Then there was another prep of a paneer soup, paneer vegetable soup. And I looked at that and I said, oh, I know I'm going to like that. So I took some of that. So I'm sitting in my room and I was eating this oat utma and it was delicious. I wanted to ask her for the recipe. It was incredible. It was so good. And I went to taste this paneer whey soup and it had too much red pepper in it. And after like 2 bites, my whole body was on fire. And I said, I'm going to have to give this to the creatures outside. So sometimes, we have to try. Someone says something really heavy and our false ego says, no! Then we can try, let me try. Let me try accepting this, try tasting it. And maybe it's actually tasty and it dissolves our false ego a little bit and we feel very happy. All right, we need to take a break, 10 minutes. Please take a real break, get up, walk around, etc. Hare Krishna. Facts. We're going to be looking at friendly rasas, unfriendly rasas, and exceptions, and some of the exceptions to the exceptions. All right, so we're going to look at friendly rasas, and we're going to have a breakout room on friendly rasas. So please take some notes on the nature of these and the importance in the development of our Krishna consciousness. So the effect of friendly rasas mixing is that it makes the rasa sweeter. When friendly rasas mix, it makes the rasa sweeter. So whenever there are two or more rasas together, one is always going to predominate. And this can be called the whole angi and the parts anga. Now, it's more supportive. So it's not that the parts create the whole, they're supporting parts. So like if you're having, things with a dip, the dip is supportive. The poppers or the chips or the French fries, they're the main thing, and the dips, the ketchup, whatever, is supportive. It's not a part like a part making up a whole. It's that you have your angi, your main whole is like the main crap, and the parts are like the condiments and the dips. All right, so first Rupa is giving examples with primary rasas as the whole. So here you have neutrality as a whole and servitude as a part. And how will I ever be able to massage the two lotus feet of your effulgent self, endowed with the form of eternity, knowledge, and bliss? Now, here we have this very difficult, perhaps controversial situation, and I consulted with people, but they couldn't figure it out either. So Jiva Goswami explains that the desire to massage the feet of the Lord, which is the touch of Dasi Rasa, is actually the desire to attain bliss by touching the form of the Lord, who's full of the highest bliss, rather than to give bliss to the Lord, because the devotee realizes the Lord as an object of bliss rather than his master. There we go. Okay, neutrality as a whole discussed as the part. My wicked self, happily situated in this body, eager to enjoy various tastes, and absorbed in this leather container made of phlegm, how do you say this? Semen and blood, is lethargic to remember Paramatma. Okay, neutrality as a whole, servitude, wonder, and ghastliness as parts. Having rejected the bliss of this body composed of flesh and blood, with my mind filled with affection, when will I, waving a chamara, serve the dark complexioned Param Brahma, who is seated calmly on a golden throne and who performs inconceivable actions? So Jiva Goswami says that this is similar as in the case of wanting to massage the lotus feet of the Lord. The desire to serve him with a chamara is actually a desire to experience the excellence of the Lord's fragrance. This is similar to Shanaka and the other Kumaras who got bliss by smelling the fragrance of the Lord's lotus feet mixed with tulsi. Okay, so again, that's why there's a little servitude, but it's just a part, because the mood is still neutral, and in neutrality, there is not a mood of giving pleasure to the Lord. Why give pleasure to the Lord? The Lord is already full of pleasure. He's the origin of all pleasure. Why give pleasure to him? All right, servitude as a whole, neutrality as a part, free from ignorance and without fault. When will I serve the Lord with the complexion of a blue lotus, who has lotus eyes and whose sweetness allows immediate surrender? So the neutral part is this being free from ignorance and without fault. That's the part that's indicating neutrality. Okay, servitude as a whole and ghastliness as a part is the Vaishnava who feels disgust upon seeing lotus-like women, wanders about dancing on remembering the lotus feet of the Lord. On dancing, of course, is an anubhava. And here's servitude as a whole, neutrality, ghastliness, and chivalry as parts. When I think of the enjoyment I had with young women, my mouth curls up in disdain, which is ghastliness. I am absorbed in hearing and contemplating to attain samadhi in the Brahman, which is neutrality. I have no desire for cities, even though they are given by you, that's Dhanavira. I am satisfied only with worshiping your feet, which of course is servitude. And every time we talk about ghastliness, it needs to be very clear that this is not aversion. What's he got against lotuses? Who has, oh, lotus-like women? He just says, it's just, one is the ghastliness is one is disgusted with a mentality of separateness from Krishna. It is not aversion. It is an ecstasy. It is a love. It's not an aversion. Very important. Always needs to be said. Okay, friendship as a whole and conjugal as a part. Oh, Subala, the young women of Raja who drink the nectar of Krishna's lips are the most fortunate of all women. So these are observations about Madhurya Ras, but not with the desire to enjoy Madhurya Ras with Krishna. Appreciation of Madhurya Ras. Friendship as a whole, laughter as a part, and Jiva Goswami says that conjugal is also a part. Oh, foolish girl, go back to Vraja. Don't flutter your eyes at me. I am not the type of person that you think. Why speak so much? When Krishna spoke in a teasing manner with one new girlfriend, Subala, his eyes bursting with laughter, gazed at Krishna. Friendship as a whole, laughter and conjugal as parts. When Subala saw Krishna rise up with great joy in order to touch himself disguised as Radha, he covered his face to hide his smile. So I thought that was also quite funny. Subala is disguised as Radha, and Krishna thinks it's Radha and gets up with the desire to touch who he thinks is Radha. And so Subala is laughing. Parental as a whole, compassion as a part. Yasoda says, my boy is herding the calves on difficult paths without umbrella or shoes. Ah, thinking of this, my mind is filled with pain. Parental as a whole, laughter as a part. Yasoda, your son has stolen a lump of butter from my home, and to make me blame my own son for his mischief, he has smeared some of the butter on my son's face while he was sleeping. Hearing this, Yasoda looked at her friend with a smiling face. These are so delightful, all these little vignettes. Okay, parental as a whole, fear, wonder, laughter, and compassion as parts. When perspiration became visible on the forehead of Krishna as he held up Govardhan, Yasoda began trembling with fear, thinking that Govardhan would fall upon him. Her eyes opened with astonishment to see him raise his left hand to lift the hill. Her cheeks were filled with laughter upon seeing his playful expressions. Tears flowed upon seeing him with his left hand held high for 7 days. Milk flowed from her breast out of affection for her sons. Now, here we have parental as the whole and just secondary rasas as supportive. So in pure friendship, there's no friendship with other primary rasas. So if a person has kevala, vatsalya bhav, then there's no other primary stai-bhavs that are friendly with it. However, there are mixtures. So there are persons, and we'll get to that at the end of this presentation, there are people who have mixtures of parental, as was discussed in the end of the section on parental ras in the Western Ocean, and it was discussed in a general way in the Southern Ocean. And so for those people, there's going to be friendly rasas within themselves. But Rupa's not giving an example of that because this is for Kevala. Please remember, compassion also means lamentation, grief. Karuna Ras isn't just compassion. It's not the only way of translating it. So tears flowed on seeing him with his left hand held high for 7 days. That is Karun Ras. It's lamentation, sorrow. Okay, conjugal as a whole, friendship as a part. So here Subala puts on Radha's clothing as a joke. And Radharani says, see how Krishna is resting his hand on the shoulder of Subala, who is dressed up just like a young girl. I think he must be sending some message to me through Subala. Prabhupada writes how sometimes Krishna would send messages to the gopis through cowherd boys who dressed up as if they were girls. That way the messages could be sent without attracting the suspicion of the elders. Conjugal as a whole, laughter as a part. Krishna in the dress of a young girl to Radharani. I am your sister. You should embrace me with affection. Radha recognized him and laughed even in front of her elders. Conjugal as a whole, friendship and chivalry as part. Krishna is glancing at smiling at trembling Chandravali. His arms are on the shoulder of his friend, and he is roaring like a lion to encourage Vrishasura, that's also Risasura, to fight with him. All right, so those were examples of primary rasas as wholes. Now we're going to have example of secondary rasas as the whole. So the common idea that the indirect rasas are always subordinate is a misconception. And when we talked about secondary rasas, we talked about that sometimes the primary recedes and then the secondary acts as if it was a primary. So laughter as a whole, conjugal as a part. When Kubja, blinded by desire, caught hold of Krishna's yellow garment, he doubled over with laughter in front of all the people. Chivalry as a whole, friendship as a part. Sridhama says, Vishala, seeing that the commander Bhadrasena has been defeated, why are you coming towards me to fight? Powerful Sridhama does not consider even 100 Balaramas. Balaram, what chance do you have in this battle? So Jiva Goswami comments that friendship is the primary rasa, but it is a part in this example where Sridhama on Krishna's side enters into combat, which is Sakya, enters into combat Vira with Balaram. All right, anger as the whole, friendship and chivalry as parts. The Pandavas, red-eyed with anger, desiring to kill arrogant Shishupal in battle for criticizing Krishna, took up their excellent weapons. Wonder as a whole, with friendship, chivalry, and laughter as parts. Now, Jiva Goswami says these are the words of a friend. This is the example of the friend's experience of rasas, not Krishna's experience. So seeing Sridhama swelling with pride as he used a very small stick to defeat Balarama, who thought himself the guru of club fighting, Krishna became joyful, his hairs stood on end, and his eyes widened. So this sounds like a description of Krishna's experience of rasa, but Jiva says Rupa is giving the experience of a devotee. Okay, the nature of the friendly relationship is that the one acting as the whole has the role of a staibhav, whether it's a primary or secondary, and the ones acting of parts have a role similar to vyavichari bhavs. So there are two possible situations. Let's say the secondary rasa is coming from a slight stimulus, then it acts like a vyavichari bhav, and it nourishes the primary rasa and disappears into the primary. If the secondary staibhav is from a strong stimulus, and we discussed this previously in Nectar Devotion, then the primary rasa contracts and nourishes the secondary rasa, but does not disappear, and the secondary rasa acts as primary. Think of this with a very common example. We're friends with somebody. They're our friends. Our primary feeling toward them is that of friendship. So maybe there's some very small joke and we're laughing together. The laughter acts as a transitory emotion, nourishing our friendship, disappears into the friendship. But let's say there's something extremely funny, and we and our friends are just, we're really laughing hysterically. The laughter takes over. Our friendship doesn't disappear, but it retreats, it contracts, and laughter dominates. And our relationship with them becomes primarily in that time one of laughter. So the example that Rupa gives is like Vamandev is the Supreme Lord and Indra is his servant, but Vamandev becomes Upendra, he becomes the brother of Indra, and he takes a role of supporting Indra. So the primary rasa always exists in the devotee. It's nourished by secondary rasas and is always independent of the others. Now with the secondary rasas, if they don't enhance the primary rasas, it becomes worthless like a piece of grass in nectar. So they have to be nourished, otherwise there's no value. Okay, we're going to have a breakout group to discuss the friendly mixture of rasas and its importance in our development of Krishna consciousness. So 10 minutes, breakout room on the friendly. Do not talk about unfriendly. That'll be the next time. So just friendly. Don't talk about unfriendly, just friendly. 10 minutes. Okay, now we're going to look at unfriendly rasas, and we're going to have a breakout room on unfriendly rasas. So please take some notes. Okay, if you have a sweet drink and you mix it with bitter or caustic tastes, the rasas become distasteful. So I have here a nice sweet drink, nice fruit lassi mixed with ketchup and mustard. Ah! So Jiva Goswami says most of these are imaginary. Most of these examples are imaginary examples. They're not from Shastra. All right, neutrality and conjugal. I wasted time in trance on Brahman, but I have not given a sidelong glance to the form of Brahman composed of bliss. So a sidelong glance is part of conjugal love. And Prabhupada comments on this mixture of neutrality and conjugal. He says, sometimes it is found in places like Vrindavan that a person with a slight devotional attitude of neutral love for Krishna may immediately and artificially try to attain to the platform of conjugal love. But because of the incompatibility of neutrality and conjugal love, the person is found to fall from the standard of devotional service. This is also a problem, of course, with the concept that I'm first going to attain absolute neutrality, and then I'm going to try to absorb myself in the intimate pastimes of Krishna. All right, an example of servitude and conjugal. And you probably remember that, as we mentioned earlier today, that in the Western Ocean, it was mentioned that those with reverential servitude, they don't discuss the conjugal rasa of Krishna. So Rupa writes, I want to see Krishna more affectionate than the pitas and always worshipped by demigods and sages. I am surprised to see that this Lord of Lakshmi has his body marked with the nail pricks of ordinary society girls. Okay, an example Rupa gives of friendship and parental. Oh, friend Krishna, embrace me with your long arms. After smelling your head, I will play with you. So this is smelling the head is parental, and playing with you is in the mood of friendship. Of course, parents sometimes play with their children, but that's different. Okay, parental and servitude. How can I call you my son when the Vedas describe you as the supreme? Mixture of conjugal and neutrality. Messenger, my youth is fleeting, so please arrange for me to have love play with Krishna today. So this detachment from transitory youth is neutrality. Okay, so we have questions in there. All right, so we are going to talk. It says parents treat their adolescents as their friends. How to understand that? We are going to talk about that in the negation of the incompatible, which will be after the break. And we have a question here. So if a person's eternal primary rasa is incompatible with conjugal rasa, they may never find conjugal rasa compatible. Only the material reflection is inevitable. I don't know what you mean by only the material reflection is inevitable. Rukmini, maybe you could explain that. Okay, going on to conjugal with parental. And please remember, again, these are imaginary to show examples. A lusty woman in Kailas once told Krishna, "My dear Krishna, may you have a long life." That's parental. Then after saying this, she embraced him obviously in a conjugal fashion rather than in a parental fashion. And Rupa says that the slightest touch of conjugal with parental has a huge negative effect. And of course, this is also true materially. Conjugal with disgust. "Oh, dark limb lover, because of my body of flesh and blood, I am not suitable for you, but accept me anyway." All right. Now, an important point here is that when there's unfriendly mixtures, generally, not always, they become what's called rasabasa. Rasabasa means either a shadow or reflection. This was described in the Eastern Oceans and in the Southern Ocean. What is rasabasa? It's a reflection, or it can become less than that, not rasa at all. So in other words, when there's unfriendly mixtures, the pleasure decreases. It becomes a semblance of pleasure. Now, again, we experience this materially. Like, let's say, again, you're with friends and something comes up that has incompatible emotions and your friendship shrinks, and you get either a semblance of taste or no taste at all. Okay, we have okay, that it would always happen. Well, we will say that all the residents of the spiritual world are facilitating directly or indirectly the union of Lakshmi Narayan, the union of Sita Ram, the union of Radha Krishna. Hanuman is definitely in Dasi Bhav, and he's very much facilitating the union of Sita Ram. But just like, again, I gave this example earlier, that with our parents. So we want to see our parents being affectionate with each other. It's pleasing for the children to see that my mother and my father love each other. It gives children actually a sense of security. But for the children to see their father and mother engage in activities that are actually, that cross the line into sexual is very, very displeasing. It upsets the children's relationship with the parents. So everybody is facilitating the Lord's loving exchange with his consorts, but the intimate details of those are not pleasing to them. It's the same with parental. With parental, again, in this world, I have 3 married children. I have a married grandchild that I want to see that my children are happy with their spouse, but I don't want to know the intimate details of their sexual life. That would be very unpalatable as for a parent to be involved like that. So I think there's some, but I certainly want them to have happiness in their married life. So I hope that makes some sense. Okay, we're going to have a breakout room on unfriendly rasas. So unfriendly rasas, and why unfriendly mixing generally just leads to a semblance of rasa. So a 10-minute breakout room on this. So I apologize, the discussion, we're going to go a little bit over time. So because we had such excellent questions and discussion, so I do apologize. We have a few more things to discuss. So Rupa discusses some exceptions when things that would normally be unfriendly are mitigated. So that would be when the conflict is negated by a statement, when the conflict is only in memory, when two rasas are being compared, when a friendly or neutral rasa intervenes, when the vishayas or the ashrayas of two conflicting rasas, but at least one of them has to be a secondary rasa, are different. So if there's a conflict between two primary rasas, even if there's different vishayas or ashrayas, there's not a negation of distaste. All right, so we're going to look at some examples of these where there's a negation of distaste in what would otherwise be unfriendly. So here's Purnamasi, and Purnamasi appreciates both the neutral rasa, because she was formerly a tapasvini, and the conjugal rasa, because she assists in that. So this might be distaste if the speaker was different, but because Purnamasi is speaking, there's a negation of distaste. She says, the yogi is eager to realize Krishna in the heart, even for a second, but this foolish girl desires to remove him from her heart completely, which of course makes her think of him even more. Then negation of distaste as a memory. These are the words of a minor demigod. Krishna used to make us laugh. Now attacked by Kaliya, he is putting us in lamentation. So again, laughter and lamentation are generally opposites, but this is a memory. Here's a negation of distaste by comparison. This is Krishna speaking to Radharani. Radharani, your 16 ornaments or material coverings are removed, and you appear to be internally enjoying like a knower of Brahman. So that would normally be neutrality and conjugal. All right, negation of distaste. So here we have again conjugal neutrality, but because wonder has interceded, it negates the distaste. Who are you? I am peacefulness. Why are you floating in the sky? In order to see the Param Brahma. Why have your eyes become so large? That's the wonder part. Oh, Ramba, my heart has somehow become agitated by Krishna's astonishing beauty. I have now fallen in love. All right, and here we have conjugal and ghastliness, which are again normally incompatible, but here, because there's different vishayas, and one is a secondary ras. So disgust is a secondary ras. The vishaya for the conjugal is Krishna. The vishaya for the disgust is common men. So this is in the joking between Krishna and Rukmini. She says, a woman who fails to relish the fragrance of your lotus feet accepts as her husband or lover a living corpse covered with skin, whiskers, nails, head hair, and body hair, and filled with flesh, bones, blood, parasites, feces, mucus, bile, and air. That's from Bhagavatam 10:60-45. Here we have different vishayas, one of which is a secondary ras again. So Radha is the object of conjugal, and the moon and lotus are the objects of disgust. Krishna says to Radha, Krishna is talking actually to a friend. Since I have seen the lotus eyes of Radharani, I spit on the moon and the lotus flower. Okay, here we have an example where the ashrayas are different in two secondary rasas. So this is chivalry and fear, which are normally, again, enemies. You can't feel chivalrous if you're afraid. So seeing Krishna victorious in fighting, the hairs of his friends stood on end in ecstasy, that chivalry. However, the complexions of his enemies became black with fear. So that's compatible because you have two ashrayas. All right, now again, if there's a conflict between two primary rasas, even with vishayas, there's still distaste. So here, the father is the object of Dasi ras, and Krishna is the object of Madhurya ras. So this is an exception to the exception. This is where there's a conflict between two primary rasas. Father, unlock the door bolt. I will go to the house of Sandipani Muni. My mind is attracted to the dark complexioned youth. And here's also the exception to the exception. when there's a conflict between two primary rasas, even with different ashrayas. So the other one was different vishayas. This is different ashrayas. So Rukmini is the ashraya of Madhurya Ras, and the speaker is the ashraya of Shantaras. Since this is according to Jiva, since the speaker is thinking of becoming a shelter of Madhurya Ras like Rukmini, there is a fault. Now, some jnanis do not find this distasteful. When will my eyes serve the eternally blissful form of Pran Brahman, whose chest is marked with kumkum from Rukmini's breast? So that is not a negation of distress, because the conflict is between two primary rasas, even though there's different ashrayas. Another way there can be negation of distress is when two conflicting part rasas both support a whole rasa. This is like joining of natural enemies to serve a common master. So you might have a god brother or god sister that you don't get along with, but you can combine together to serve your guru. So here's an example. There's two conflicting part rasas, chivalry and fear are in conflict, but they can both nourish parental. Nandamar says, Yasoda, your son is softer than jasmine and Keshi demon is harder than a mountain. Because of this, my mind is quivering, so that's fear. Let my son have all auspiciousness, that's parental. Raising this pillar, I will pulverize this demon and make Gokula worthy of praise. That is chivalry. So Jiva also says that the different vishayas should be considered factors in harmonizing these, because fear is toward the demon and chivalry is toward Gokula. And both chivalry and fear are nourishing Nanda's parental rasa. Okay, this is also another example, and I kept saying we were going to discuss this. This is if there's conflicting primary rasas, but they occur at different times in the same person. So the example is given of Yudhisthira. So Yudhisthira combines Dasya, Vatsalya, and Sakya, which are in conflict. Dasya, you see Krishna as superior. Vatsalya, you see Krishna as inferior. Sakya, you see Krishna as equal, but they exist at different times. And there were many combinations given in the Southern Ocean for individuals, as we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. And at the end of the parental Ras section in the Western Ocean, there were also many examples given of individuals who always have a mixture of primary rasas, some of which could be seen as being conflicting, but they don't experience all of them at the same time. They experience them in different situations. So if they had a rasa that was not compatible with the situation, that would be a conflict. Another negation of distaste is in Mahabhava, where incompatible rasas don't have any negative effect in Mahabhava of the conjugal rasa. The example was given in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 3.5.23. There was a demon. The Brahmanas were speaking praises. Balaram was there, and still Radha Krishna felt love for each other. Okay, other examples are when Krishna is the Vishaya of various rasas. And the example was given when Krishna enters the wrestling arena of Kamsa, and all the different persons there, they had different rasa experiences with Krishna simultaneously. And that description is wonderful. Another example, of course, would be Govardhan Hill, but this one is specifically in the Bhagavatam. Some of the people felt neutrality, some of them felt servitorship, some of them felt parental, some of them felt conjugal, and they were all together in the same place. But with Krishna as the object, there was no distaste from these different combinations. Now, another example is in Rupa Goswami's giving a benediction, where Krishna is the ashraya of various tastes. So here's where Krishna is experiencing all different rasas. Though lifting up Govardhan, he remained without pride in himself, Shantaras. When the small children became eager to hold up the mountain, he smiled, Hastyaras and Vatsalyaras. He spat at some bad-smelling yogurt, Vivatsaras. He showed off his great strength in lifting the mountain for the benefit of his dear friends, Sakyaras and Viraras. He displayed red eyes looking at Indra, Rodra. He shed tears on seeing the suffering of the inhabitants of Raja from rain and wind, Karuna. He trembled in fear before the elders, having destroyed the sacrifice to Indra, Dasya, Bhayanika. His eyes opened wide with astonishment on seeing the great torrents of rain, Adbhuta. His hair stood on end when he saw the young girls, Madhurya. May this master, the lifter of Govardhan, protect you. So here there's also no distaste. Yes, they weren't interacting with each other. Correct. Yes. Okay. I was going to have time for questions, but we had too many questions before, so we don't have any time now. We're already over time. And this is the basic understanding of the combination of rasas, and all glories to Srila Prabhupada. So next week is our final class. Next week, we're looking at the last chapter of Nectar of Devotion, chapter 51. It will be at the same time as today. And they will be looking at things that look like rasa and aren't. That look like rasa, but aren't. That's been touched on previously. It was touched on in today's class. We're going to go into it in more depth. So my apologies for going over because we had some lively discussions, and I was thinking I should say, oh, we have to go on because of the time, but I thought they were so important that perhaps you would tolerate my lack of punctuality and ending. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Jai, jai, jai.
Thank you, Madhu.